Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fifth session. I believe, yeah, the fifth session of our series, Let's Talk Mental Health. Before we jump right into this session, we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. So Uplift Black acknowledges that we are situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. So we would also like to thank JD Engineering for sponsoring this series. And as with all of the other sessions we've had, we are super lucky to have Debbie hosting today's session again. She is an influential mother of four and a registered psychotherapist who works to erase the stigma associated with mental health and give people the tools they need to share their story. Debbie has extensive experience in mental health advocacy as a workshop facilitator, clinical consultant, and television host. Her work takes an anti-oppressive approach, is focused on healing, and is informed by a trauma and anti-Black racism lens. And tonight we are also joined by Michael Bowe, and he has over 20 years of experience as an equity and community engagement advocate. Most of those years were spent in the Jane and Finch community, where he lived and worked with immigrant and refugee groups, ethno-racial and low-income families, survivors of family violence, among other community members. During the latter parts of the 1990s, he was a well-known writer in the Caribbean community across the GTA as a beloved but hard-hitting weekly social justice columnist with Pride News magazine. Mr. Bowe has a master's in social work degree from York University and has worked in the field of child welfare for over 18 years. As a former employee of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, he founded Soul Journey. The Soul Journey experience is a series of excursions that offer participants, such as child and youth in care, foster parents, and staff, an awe-inspiring view of the African Canadian experience. Mr. Bowe has extensive experience leading organizational change processes to increase workplace diversity and inclusion. As the equity senior leader at Simcoe Muskoka Family Connections, he accelerated the agency's equity journey by transforming its governing and operational strategies. So tonight, Debbie and Michael will discuss the structural perpetuation of anti-Blackness and how this impacts individuals and their mental health as well. And as usual, if you have any other questions, just put it into the Facebook comment section and we can get to them there. And I'm going to let Debbie take over now.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you. Oh, and welcome everybody. This is we're doing back to back, and each week is exciting. So I'm thrilled to be doing this and to be speaking with you, Michael. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I'm so excited about this topic and just what we're going to discuss and just kind of what we're going to really experience and learn tonight. So let's get into it. So thank you so much for being here.
A pleasure. Let's get into it.
All right. Okay. So I always like to start off with this journey that people are on. And so I would love for you to kind of start off by talking to us about where did it all begin for you and how did you get to where you are right now?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Where do I begin? I guess I'll begin with my immigration experience to Canada. And my mom immigrated first from Jamaica to establish herself, like thousands of Jamaicans at that particular time, say late 70s, early 80s. So she came on her own to establish herself, met my dad,
yes.
And sent for us. And I was 9 at the time, my sister was 10. So my dad being my stepdad, but he is my dad. Yes. I can't really say too much about my biological in terms of where that lands, but that's another story. Mm-hmm. So yeah, she settled, sent for us, and then we came here, which has been the immigration experience of so many of us. And it just caused a lot of disruption. It has broken families apart. It has put lives at stake.
Yeah.
So on. So yeah, that's my immigration experience. Landed in the Jane and Finch community. It was a very cold February day, I remember. And I was seeing snow for the first time. Just from Jamaica out of the airport. I was like, what is this? And then we drove home. And we were at the time staying at 235 Gosford Boulevard, which is in near the Jane and Finch community, Jane and Shoreham.
Yes.
And I was seeing this massive building. It's a 16-story building. And I thought, this is where we live? Like,
Oh,
not
wow.
knowing that it wasn't the entire building, it was just an apartment. 'Cause I didn't see an apartment before
Right.
a building that size. And yeah, I kind of took hold from there in terms of my Jane Finch upbringing, and then going on to university at York, eventually earning an MSW, coming
Mm.
out and working at Toronto, then York, CAS, and now I'm at Simcoe.
All right. All right. Did your upbringing, did your experiences lead you to where you are now and getting your MSW and, working with the Jane Finch area with CAS? Is your experience what influenced you to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes our experiences draw us to the field of social work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I actually wanted to be a family therapist to begin with, and I was pursuing that in my MSW, and I was doing my practicum at Hinks Delcrest. But then a friend, Saeed, he drew me into child welfare, and he's like, "Come on, Michael!" And I went for the interview, and I got the job, and I said, "Okay, I'm just going to be here for 5 years, and I'm heading back to be a therapist." And here I am, 21 years later. So I didn't quite leave. But the reason why I stayed, though, is because of anti-Black racism that is steeped within child welfare, as well as anti-Indigenous racism.
Okay.
And that's where, in terms of my equity work with Simcoe Muskoka Family Connections, begins and continues into it. I do a lot of learning sessions, for example, but that's just a part of the whole.
Yeah.
I assist the organization through developing a framework towards working towards equity. And I do that helping our board of governors as well as our organizational leaders, cascading into our middle managers all the way down to direct service staff and into families. And we have some incredible leaders. One being, of course, our CEO, Geraldine. She's just amazing in terms of really wanting to get to the bottom of the work that needs to be done.
That's right.
So just to cap your question off, really what drew me to the work is addressing all forms of oppression, as well as the work that we need to do around the Indigenous journey that we need to be on in terms of respecting the rights of First People, for self-governance, for self-determination, respecting their heritage, their rights, and so forth, and recognizing that we are either treaty bearers where treaties exist, which basically across Simcoe and Muskoka, they're treaties. Yes. And it's to find out which treaty inhabits your part of that territory. And of course, where there are no treaties there, then it's unceded territory and you have to proceed accordingly in terms of band council, whatever governance is domain over that land. So essentially, in addressing all forms of oppression, as well as doing my part with regards to decolonizing or working through an anti-colonial lens, is the framework that we've adopted at Simcoe Muskoka Family Connection. And what that is we have to enter the conversation through an anti-racist framework. Okay. And in particular, looking at anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. The reason being is that those are the bodies caught up in our systems and are doing poorly in all systems, whether you look at child welfare, policing, justice, healthcare. Right. Every single one of them, you'll find Black and Indigenous folk at the bottom. Even when you look at all equity-seeking identities, whether it be persons live with a disability, whether it be along the lines of gender expression, sexual orientation, yes, Black and Indigenous folks are found at the bottom of those statistics. So that's very interesting. Looking for them, because if you don't go looking for them, you won't find them, because they're normally, the numbers are very small. Right. In those groups, right? So I often give the example of a school board. The director of education might say, "Oh, we're doing fabulous. Yeah. You know, 90% of our students are doing just amazing in terms of their well-being and academic performance. But if you say, who's in the 10%? The director of education might say, oh, okay, we never disaggregated the data. Well, let's look. And they might discover that perhaps 65% of those caught up in that, 65% of the indigenous population in their board are caught up in that 10%, and perhaps the same amount in terms of Black students.
Right.
But in terms of raw numbers, that might be 20 students out of 1,000. It might be 25 students who are indigenous, 20 students who are Black. So if you don't go looking for them, you won't find them.
Right.
But as I noted to folks, you don't stop there. Of course, you look for those who are racialized white and brown, who have equity-seeking identities and who are marginalized because of that. So it's not that you stop up Black and brown folk, or Black and indigenous folk, but you have to go looking for them first. Then you drop down into other racialized identities, all their intersectionality, and then you do it in a way that is trauma-informed, healing-centered, that is completely safe, responsive, and relevant.
So there's multiple layers to this, right? When you talk about the 90%, that's a high number. And I can see why people look at that number and say, we're doing fabulous, 90%. And how often do we ask, what about this 10% though?
Absolutely.
What are we doing about the 10%?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you look at even the current pandemic, some numbers were pulled in terms of who the virus is impacting the most. And 93% of Simcoe Muskoka are racialized white. And the other 7% are minoritized racialized groups. So non-white racialized groups. So only 7% of the population is non-white racialized peoples. But I believe it was 45% of those infected with COVID-19 are a part of that 7%, right? So
and
again,
that's Simcoe Muskoka, that's Simcoe County.
Yes, they launched some numbers, and it was done off numbers from July to December, I believe, of last year. They pulled some numbers and sample, and they realized that it's 7% of the population that is non-white racialized that's carrying over 40% of infections. So again, if you don't disaggregate the data and go looking for that 7%, you will not find it. You'll pay attention to 93% and say, oh, okay, we're doing all right.
Yes.
So, you know, we have to do the work, and that's why we have to look at disaggregated data.
So, I mean, I'm willing to believe that when you got into, you know, your line of work, or even working in the child welfare system, were you naive to all of this? Did you know that this was happening, or did something really trigger this for you to actually understand that this is what's happening across all systems?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's complex, but I'll try to simplify my answer. Essentially, prior to getting into child welfare, as noted, I was working on my master's, aiming to be a therapist, but I was also writing for Pride News magazine. So I was writing articles on various social issues and so forth. So I was very familiar with what's going on across various sectors. So when I entered the field of child welfare, I brought that framework. I don't like saying lens, even though it's easier to say that. I don't like equity lens because it gives the impression you could take off those lens when you're at home and do whatever you want, and then at work, to be PC, you put back your equity lens on and all that. So I like to say a framework to make it more permanent.
Yes.
So I'm operating through an equity framework, or an anti-racist, anti-oppressive framework, or intersectionality framework. But anyways, I brought that framework into my work in child welfare and kept that alive. And I did frontline for about 8 years at York, at Toronto CAS, before I came to York and became an equity lead. And that's where I started that part of my journey. And then now I'm a senior manager of equity for Simcoe Muskoka Family Connections.
Oh, wow. Wow. So you've got this broad range of experience. I know we're all in the same province and relatively not that far away from each other, but going from Toronto to York to Simcoe County, what differences are you seeing? Did you see? in terms of the structural organization, the systems? What did you see?
Well, from Toronto, Toronto proper, it's far more resourced in terms of serving various equity-seeking groups, as well as Indigenous mainland folks, because it's the hub, right? It's the urban center. That's where all of our major corporate offices are, RBC, CIBC, for various different institutions. So it's the hub. That's where our media is, our provincial government, their headquarters and all that. So they get a lot of the resources. As you drift more north and you get into York region, the resources drop off very sharply, but you still have them.
Yes.
And you have various associations led largely by Black women, for example, for the Black community. You have VACA, Vaughan African Canadian Association, and it's now Encore. That's Jeanette Martin that leads that. You have children, Parents for Black Children. That's Carrie Daniels there, and others. You have MACA, the Markham African Canadian Caribbean Association. You have the York Region Alliance of African Canadian Communities. So you have so many, I could go on, TACA. So you have all these associations, and it's normally led by a person with great passion, and largely women, Black women. So they evolve these associations, lack of core funding or funding at all, and they drive advocacy work. Now, when you drift out of York region and you end up in Simcoe, not even Muskoka yet, everything just falls off sharply. And the type of resources, community supports falls off. And that's why you need organization like Uplift Black. And they're flourishing, and other similar organizations that are looking for status and so forth, like charitable status and all that. You quickly need that on board. So I see the work being done, and very rapidly within Simcoe in particular. Muskoka, things are even drop off even more sharply. More north. But I see the capacity. I see Shaq's World, and I'm like, wow, it's actually an incredible achievement. Because not even in York region do you have a building, an actual building dedicated and centered on Black folk, but not exclusive to Black folk, but centered on a meeting hub, not even in York region. So even though York region benefits in terms of the number of association it has in the years, because MAC has been around almost 30 years. Simcoe, with the founding of Shaq's World and having a community hub, that's incredible. Like
it is absolutely phenomenal. It's amazing. It is absolutely amazing. Would you say that the lack of the resources has to do with the minority of Blacks or racialized cultures being in Simcoe County? Does that have anything to do with it?
Absolutely, because I believe people of African descent only make up 3% of the population across Simcoe, Muskoka. And they're scattered across a massive geographic space with a lack of transportation infrastructure and all that. So finding community becomes more difficult. If you're calling a meeting or a gathering, where is community? Where do you find folks, and where do they find you? So because the community is so small and scattered across a diverse as well as a large geographic space, it's very hard to find those community and build a momentum towards even asking for funding or to providing programming and so forth. And that's why, Uplift Black and other groups like it within and across Simcoe, Muskoka, so important in germinating what needs to go. Because I could see 5 years from now, the various associations will have formal status, will have developed perhaps some seed grant, maybe even core funding.
Yep.
and would have developed infrastructure across Simcoe Muskoka. And to the benefit and to the, to, I guess, the kudos to Simcoe Muskoka Family Connections, what we have done is develop, because we noticed that the lack of infrastructure. And well, to back up, the sector, the child welfare sector, developed what we call One Vision, One Voice, OVOV initiative, which is an initiative to develop a service delivery framework to serve Black families in particular, and children and youth tethered to those Black families. And it's governed by 11 race equity practices that each organization across, child welfare organization across the province, most of them have committed to.
Right.
So our organization, Simcoe Muskoka Family Connections, have committed to those 11 race equity practices, which start from governance, what the board needs to do, have like a directional statement around service to Black communities, collecting data and performance related data, and have performance markers and so forth. Then the CEO has things the CEO needs to do, senior leadership as well as HR, middle managers, direct service staff, community engagement. So there are 11 practices that covers off from the Board of Governors all the way into community engagement. So part of that, we struck an OVOV Black Community Advisory Committee to keep us accountable to those 11 race equity practices. And from that committee, it was suggested that perhaps we develop a council because to give some coordination around the development that's needed across Simcoe and Muskoka in terms of developing, doing some community development work in the Black community. So essentially we established the Simcoe Muskoka Black Community Development Council, which is populated by large institutions, mid-sized institutions, and Black grassroots organizations, where we could come together and leverage the resources in the big institutions to help to develop the grassroots Black organizations to expand. So from that, to me, hope is built in terms of, again, 5 years from now, I think we're going to look very different than we do now. And there's some incredible Black women that are leading the charge across Simcoe Muskoka and building that capacity.
That's amazing. That is amazing. Wow. So let's switch gears and talk about mental health as it relates to all these different systems and what you're noticing, what you have noticed, what you're noticing now in terms of mental health. I particularly want to start off with the child welfare system and, Black children, Black youth, Indigenous, racialized cultures in the child welfare system in terms of mental health. What do you notice? What have you seen?
All right, so that's the big question. Well, mental health is tethered to so many things. And we have to first tether it to, if we're talking about Black folk, we have to tether it to the legacy of colonization, the legacy of slavery and patriarchy in this country, Canada.
Yes.
So we can't understand how anti-Black racism is unfolding in terms of trauma in people's mental health unless you understand the legacies that underlie anti-Black racism. And we can't speak of mental health when it comes to Black folk without connecting those legacies to the present. So when we talk about mental health in the Black community, when we talk about trauma, because that's a part of the mental health, and we have historical and intergenerational trauma that's tethered back to those legacies, slavery in this country, colonization, patriarchy, and capitalism, because capitalism is tied to slavery, right? So first you have to understand that and the intergenerational trauma that still remains within us from that legacy, and how it shows up in our families, in ourselves, and how we show up in our lives, right?
Yes.
So you have to tether it back. You also have to tether it back to white supremacy. And this is where the indigenous piece comes in. I'm so glad that we did the land acknowledgement, and this is an opportunity to talk truth into that land acknowledgement. And when I do various learning sessions within my organization, or I do have a bit of a consultancy on the side, I often bring up the fact that prior to contact, there were 60 million indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. And some people say 73 million people, indigenous. Then you had contact, right? Christopher Columbus, 1942, and then others from England, Portugal, and so forth. Then you had contact, and after that contact took place, long story short, population was cut to 6 million out of 60 million people.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And in Canada, what we now call Canada, it went from, people said there was about 1 million or so, from 500,000 to 1 million indigenous peoples in what we now call Canada. Who knows the actual number? Like it's more. What you have today was 100% prior to contact. What you have today now is 4.9% of the population are indigenous, right?
Yeah.
Or 1.7 million people. And those who are racialized white, it's now 79%. So you could see where white supremacy comes into the fold. If you just put the numbers to it. And basically, those who colonized Canada, I wasn't, first was the Vikings, but they didn't last really long. And I guess they were here until 1025 AD. And then off of the coast of Nova Scotia, then they disappeared. Then the French came. And long story short, then the English came after them, and so on. So then you had, 100% indigenous folk. Then today you have 79% of the population being racialized white across Canada, and only 4.9% of those indigenous. So again, when we talk of white supremacy, that's basically what it is. It's basically dominance and supremacy of one racial group over all others. And they build institutions in their likeness and for their benefit. So whether that be child welfare, policing, justice, health, public health, and so forth.
All those things that we all need.
That we all need. So that's where the work of indigenous communities, what they would say is that their work is sovereignty, because they have they're the only peoples in this, if we're just focused on Canada, that has nation to nation relations to government, the federal government, and so forth, as well as other governments. Black folk don't, and other equity seeking groups, whether based on persons with a disability, gender expression, faith, what have you. So they're the only one with nation-to-nation relations. They're seeking sovereignty. They're seeking against, as I mentioned off the top, self-governance, respect for their heritage, and all those pieces. Black folk were equity seeking. We're seeking equitable treatment in these institutions. We're trying to make them more equitable, right? Which equity is basically giving people what they need, so that they have equal access to their dreams, to their lives, to services, resources, and so forth. So essentially, if we look at white supremacy from the number count, as well as who built the institutions and for whom, it wasn't built for indigenous peoples and for everyone else that followed, or for Black folk who arrived here being enslaved or running to come here for freedom, which looks very different if we get into that conversation, what really freedom looked like in Canada. So if you look at from that perspective, you have a better understanding as what white supremacy is. It's basically one racial group having supremacy over all others and a built institution in their likeness and for their benefit. Oftentimes, though, we think of the white supremacist, which is someone who, out of racial hate, does something like maybe strap chain someone to the back of a pickup truck and
Right.
drive them
Yeah.
for miles. So that's a white supremacist. But white supremacy occurs with or without hate. It's
Okay.
just the system that we breathe in, that we swim in, that's all
Yes.
around us.
Right.
So white supremacy also is baked into how we experience our mental health as Black folk, as well as how others experience it, including those racialized white.
Right.
So it's very complex. When we think of mental health, we have to think in terms of historical and intergenerational trauma, as well as how it shows up as a result of trauma experienced in our families.
Yes.
Someone might have harmed us in our families
Yes.
based on harm done to them, or that intergenerational historical trauma that shows up
Right.
and passed on down in our genes, because research has shown that our genes actually changes as a result of trauma. And of course, there's trauma caused by systems and structures.
Right. It's so interesting because I don't know how many people look to that intergenerational trauma when they, think about, well, what's wrong with me, or what's happening, or why is this happening to me? To look back and to think back to ancestors and what they dealt with. A lot of people haven't got to that point where they're like, we got to look beyond what's happening right now. What happened in the past? And what haven't we dealt with? What do we just keep going with? What do we keep having going on and not have looked into and really dived into and really heal from what we've experienced, our ancestors experienced? So it's really like, it's fascinating. The aha moments that people get when they realize, wow, there's more here. There's more here. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of excellent research and writing being done currently about that.
Yes.
Oftentimes I've encountered obscure literature or speakers who have spoken about it, but now folks are writing more and more about it. And where they're landing the conversation is that white supremacy has occurred in medieval times. It started by white people actually harming other white people in Portugal, in Spain, all over Europe, in Britain and all that.
Yes.
Torturing people, seeing heads on spikes, bodies being embedded in cast iron, like enclosed, heads being chopped off, various forms of torture and all that. So you've seen that baked in your DNA for centuries, right? And then came this whole invention of race, where one racial group, based on these made-up characteristics, being during this scientific racism during the Enlightenment period.
Right.
So we're looking at the 17th century. And then what happened is that baked in trauma, centuries of trauma that people who are racialized white in these European countries that have inflicted on each other, brought it now through colonization, which led to slavery, slavery of people of African descent.
Right.
And that now is baked in us in terms of white supremacy through the trauma of white people.
Yes.
Then the trauma of being enslaved, being colonized, and so on. So that's how it passes through our genes, through our ancestry. And we often don't think of that level of historical and intergenerational trauma that still lives in white bodies, in black bodies, in brown bodies, and indigenous bodies. And that's the layer that we need to begin to acknowledge and work through.
Okay, so I'm going to address that because I think that part is fascinating as well. But I also wonder, you said that people are doing the research into intergenerational trauma now. Like we're really researching and looking into it. What triggered that? Why are we now looking into it? What had to happen for us to really acknowledge and say, okay, we gotta go deeper in this? What happened?
I think there's a lot of research being done. on how intergenerational trauma changes our genetic makeup.
Yeah.
First of all, indigenous peoples have been talking about this for eons around blood memory.
Yes.
Blood memory.
Yes.
That's that intergenerational trauma. And people are saying, oh, come on. How could trauma be passed down through genes and through memory and through people's bodies? But now research is catching up to say, oh, yeah, that is the case, as well as trauma research, intergenerational trauma research done by survivors of the Holocaust.
Yes.
That research has been tremendous.
Right.
Folks have been doing research on rats, whereby they traumatize rats with electric shock and so forth.
Right.
And then what they do is cut a layer of skin out of that parent and then carve it in another rat, right? The descendants of that particular rat, and then maybe play a music to see if the body responds to that trauma, even though it's in another generation. So they've been doing a lot of scientific research again on those who survived the Holocaust, as well as we've been told for centuries by various indigenous communities across the planet, but more so on this land by indigenous people, said there's blood memory. As well. I remember I did a symposium back in 2015 around Truth and Reconciliation, just prior to the Truth and Reconciliation report being launched. And I had Archbishop Desmond Tutu involved. He was supposed to come to be a keynote, but he couldn't. His daughter came instead. I had the former cellmate of Nelson Mandela.
Wow.
Attended. We also had Dr. Cindy Blackstock was also one of the speakers.
Wow.
And I also got folks who survived the Rwanda genocide. And the whole idea was, what could we as Canadians learn from other truth and reconciliation processes that have happened across the planet?
Okay.
But anyways, my point in bringing that up, I remember that Archbishop Desmond Tutu's daughter said that one of the things that she often thought about was when these massive tanks will roll into various townships and to harass the people, to traumatize them, blaring speakers. And, she would say it was really young boys, say 17, 18, 19, that were on these vehicles operating as paramilitary forces. And she often said that their bodies are also traumatized as they're inflicting trauma on them, beating them up, and also, and all those stuff. So she said,
like literally traumatized, like
really,
they've been,
yeah, right. So she was saying she was not only concerned about her body, because trauma impacts your body and is transformed and translated and experienced by your body. But oftentimes we do talk therapy up here.
Yes.
But it's really, trauma is trapped in our bodies. So we have to get deep and into our bodies when we do various somatic forms of therapy and so forth, as opposed to just talk therapy. But anyway, she was saying, I often wonder, those 18-year-old boys, 19-year-old boys that were coming in to our township on these massive tanks and to wreak havoc on us and terror, what their bodies are going through and what they carry with them.
Yes.
What they pass on to their future generations, as we, as Black folk that are being traumatized, of what we pass down to successive generations. So it was really interesting how Dr. Sinclair was also there. He was heading up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the time.
Yeah.
He basically was talking about blood memory. I can't remember Archbishop Desmond Tutu's daughter, but she was also a person of the cloth. But because of her gender identity, she basically lost her role in the church. In the it's another story that we got to tackle.
Yeah.
So essentially, everyone was talking about intergenerational trauma, but from different approaches.
Right.
using different language, but they were
Right.
all talking about the same thing.
Right.
So yeah, we have to begin to tackle historical and intergenerational trauma, beginning with white supremacy that started out in medieval Europe, and
Yes.
how white bodies were torturing other white bodies, and others viewing that as a public, because you're shopping your downtown corridor, you're seeing again heads on spikes, you see
Yeah.
people being tortured and all that. So that's baked into your DNA. And
Yes.
then when you start to disseminate and colonize other parts of the planet, you're bringing that, and you're also torturing people, you're killing people en masse and so forth. And that lives in not only their bodies, but also
Yeah.
yours. So we all have to deal and help each other deal with that historical and intergenerational trauma. In order for one to heal, all must heal, including those who are racialized white, Black, brown, and indigenous folks. So we all have work to do
Right.
in dealing with that trauma.
And so it's fascinating what you're saying, because I was going to mention, we talk about even slave owners and how they treated their slaves, and maybe what their children saw and what their children knew was, okay, this is what we do. And that trauma that has been inflicted on them, just like you're talking about those young soldiers, now what are the white racialized people bringing on to their generation and generation and generation, and now where are they left as well? So you're right, it's not just about racialized people looking into this trauma, but it's white people as well. There's trauma there.
Yeah, and it was during the latter parts of the 1600s, right? I think it was 1693 that the term Negro came into being.
Yes.
So that's when race started to take hold, and race found its origins.
Yes.
And that the whole idea of race in the Americas and taking shape, especially in America, it came into being because those who were racialized white and poor were basically teaming up with enslaved Africans to get better to get better, I guess, working situations and so forth on plantations.
Okay.
So basically, the plantation owners say, you know what, we got to separate poor white people from their Black counterparts, because they're forming coalitions and they're fighting against us.
Right.
So they went and say, you know what, you're one of us. And in fact, here's a parcel of land. You're white, we're white. So you're one of us. Don't partner with them. They're different. They're Negroes.
Yeah.
And so on. And in fact, we will make you overseers of them, and we will pay you, and again, give you a parcel of land. So that's when the division became into being, to separate poor white people from their enslaved counterparts, and so forth. And essentially, that system never quite left us in terms of the various stratification of class and wealth and the have and have-nots. So essentially, even in the Americas, the bodies of poor white people were being traumatized by their white counterparts that were landowners and very wealthy. So even in the Americas, folks who are racialized white and living in poverty were impacted by those who were from the prominent class. So even white supremacy impacted their bodies, as it did enslaved Africans. And as I must say, when as I'm sure you're aware, Italians, right?
Yes.
The Irish, Jewish people, had to ascend into whiteness.
Yes.
Because they were on the gradients of Blackness, and I say gradients, so gradients to whiteness. So they had to earn their racialized whiteness. It didn't come to them. They were more racialized Black. That's where you have all the Black Italians and the Black Irish and so forth. So there's also literature about how the Irish became white and so on. So they were also racialized non-white. They had to earn their whiteness and were granted whiteness. And that became into being when basically the upper class needed to expand the pool of whiteness and say, okay, fine, you could be white and you could benefit from what it is to be white.
What would happen if you didn't become white? What would happen, to the Irish and to the Italians that couldn't get into that elite group? Were they then treated like the slaves, like the Black people, like the racialized other people? Were they treated that same way?
Well, Irish folk in particular, definitely, and others were treated poorly, but they were definitely treated very badly and so forth. Some authors, some scholars tried to compare it to the treatment that was issued to enslaved Africans, but folk rebuked that and said, no, that was on a completely different level. But yeah, essentially, they were treated very poorly. And I'm thinking whether to get into the conversation of even going far back where scientific racism came into being and so forth, and how it was propagated. Because there's also layers of whiteness.
Oh, there's so many layers.
There's the Mediterranean white, so they are more olive in complexion. You have the Nordics, who are whiter. You have the Teutonics. You have Hitler was trying to replicate this particular category of whiteness. I can't remember.
So you're talking about like the blonde hair, blue eyes?
Yes. It's the most common form of whiteness that people refer to.
Oh, the Aryan race?
The Aryans.
Yes.
So you have various layers of whiteness. So even whiteness has its own layers. And basically, certain layers are more valued than others. Of course, people forgot that history. And basically what Hitler was trying to do was, through positive and negative eugenics, basically create the Aryan race, that blue-eyed, blonde people with the right complexion. So
meanwhile, he wasn't.
Right, yes. So a lot of people who are racialized white today would not have passed the snuff test to be in that Aryan category of whiteness. So the Aryans, the Nordics, you have the Teutonics, then you have the Mediterraneans, which is darker in skin complexion. So even whiteness has its gradients, just like blackness. Shadism or colorism. The lighter you are,
another issue.
Okay, let's not go there. So even in whiteness, there's gradients of whiteness, but of course we have lost that knowledge of it, and so on. So, and I will complete the thought, even though this is not the subject matter. So in terms of positive eugenics, Hitler, what he was doing, and other nations, including the US and Canada, was trying to get the perfect white people to marry each other and procreate, or to couple up at least, so that blonde, blue-eyed, the proper complexion of the Aryan
race.
And then through negative eugenics, which is getting rid of people who didn't fit the bill. Right. So even in the United States, people were sterilized because so that they won't procreate. You had it gets really complicated. But even a part of that negative eugenics, if you committed a crime, basically they would find various ways of ensuring that you don't procreate. If you were considered having a mental health or a disability or poor, back then they called them pauper. Basically, they were trying to eliminate those folks. So in the States, they sterilized 15,000 people because, again, they didn't fit the bill of what whiteness is. So, but that's another lane we could go down.
Another thing, yeah. So then I wonder, okay, we come back to present day. How do we see these things being displayed in the culture today, into generations today? You know, I mean, we're not sterilizing people anymore, I hope not, but you know, how are we seeing these things still being in play for us today?
Well, I think that's where various forms of isms come into play.
Mm.
And again, in order to understand how they're showing up today, you have to talk about that legacy that we just came off of.
Yes.
So to understand sexism, you have to understand patriarchy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
In order to understand anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, you have to go back to the Crusades and understand that legacy and how it tethers to the present. In order to understand, as I mentioned, anti-Black racism, you have to tether to capitalism, Canada, slavery, patriarchy, and so on. So basically how they're showing up is just looking at the numbers. If you look at who dominates and runs Canada, for example, you're looking at those who are largely racialized white and male. So some stats were drawn in 2016 and 2014 and so forth, and that's what Canada, they hide their numbers, but now and then you get some numbers. We're going to be doing a better job because the government is now saying you have to collect disaggregated data so we know how people are doing based on their varying identities, including race. Right. But the scant data that we have, it has shown that 97% of judges across Canada are white and are males. 93% of Board of Governors, white, largely males. Prior to Trudeau, it was 85% of MPs, white, mostly males. Academia, 85%, I think it's 87% in terms of academia, university and all that, professors, white, mostly males. When you have diversity, it's on the lines of gender, sexual diversity, and they fill those spots with folks who are racialized white. And it goes on and on. So that's how it shows up in today. So essentially, when you look at, say we take child welfare, when, say, a child who's racialized Black, Brown, or Indigenous comes into care, they will likely be apprehended by a white worker who reports to a white supervisor, a white director, and who reports to a white CEO, and the board is largely white. That child would be placed in a likely a white foster home. Right. The judge, the family judge that they will go in front of would be racialized white. Right. The lawyers involved would be racialized white. Right. For the most part, it's very exceptional. You see different. That the school that the person goes to, and if we talk about Simcoe Muskoka, but we could broaden it across other areas, the teacher would be racialized white. The director of education, all those pieces, right? The likelihood is almost that is what is going to happen. So even in child welfare, if you look at who populate the leadership complement of child welfare, it's those who are racialized white. We only have one executive director, Rav Bain, out of PLCAS, that is, he is racialized brown. Everyone else is racialized white. We do have the CEO of OACAS, the Ontario Association of Children's Society. She's a Black woman. She's the first Black CEO.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In the sector, but she oversees the association that oversees, basically it's a member of agencies in child welfare in the province. So they're roughly, I think, about 52 CASs across the province. Yes. And they have membership to OACAS, the Ontario Children's.
Got it. Yes.
So she oversees the association, but in terms of the the mainstream CASs, they're all racialized white in terms of their leadership, their
Yes.
CEO, and so on. They're getting a bit better when it comes to director of service and senior managers. They're starting to, with a lot of push, and it's taken years, you're starting to see directors of service that are racialized Black, which gives folks an opportunity to
Yes.
become a CEO. So Board of Education, again, largely racialized white.
Yeah.
And so forth. And if you look across the corporate sector, those who lead corporate institutions and so forth are largely men who are racialized white. And when you come to the human services sector, it's largely women racialized white. So that's how those legacies shows up in today's society. And that's why people need to really adopt this work from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive intersectionality approach.
Yes.
That is trauma-informed, healing-centered,
Yes.
that is culturally relevant, responsive, and safe. Because you have folks who are racialized white taking care of those who are indigenous, who are racialized Black and brown. So they have to do it in a way that, because that's not going to change anytime soon.
Right.
That is culturally safe, that is formed by some form of anti-racist paradigm. Because if you're not working from that, basically you have one racialized group in charge of all others.
Right.
So that's why you have to come from that lens. And that's why, if you look at Simcoe Muskoka, again, 93% of the population is racialized white.
Yeah.
And they lead all the institutions for the most part and so on. And that 7% who are non-racialized white folk,
yes,
we are in their hands. So that's where they have to approach the work from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens.
Yes.
And it has to be informed, trauma-informed, and culturally safe.
That's important, that culturally safe part too. Because when I moved up to Simcoe County, it was the first time that I actually opened up the newspaper and I saw an advertisement from Family Connections that said that we are looking for mixed race families to be foster parents. Right? And I never seen that before. I thought, oh my gosh, they're actually advertising for people. And I said, well, I wonder why that is. And I'm like, well, I know why that is, because you have Black children, you have Indigenous children, you have racialized children in the system who are going to white foster families. And they are not bringing their culture with them. They're losing out on that. So why not have foster families that can identify with these children? And that's who they were looking for. It was fascinating to me that they advertised this in the newspaper, that, like, this is an ad. We need more racialized people to be part of this family, to help and support.
It's interesting that you're saying that, because we're launching a campaign.
Yeah.
A foster parent campaign. It's going to be launched soon to recruit foster parents from all identities, and there will be a focus on recruiting more Black foster parents, because again, Black and Indigenous kids are being placed in white foster homes.
Right.
So we need more foster parents in that regard that reflect different racialized identities, as well as folks from different intersecting identities across gender, gender expression, sexual orientation, faiths, and so forth. But yes, we're actually going to be doing a campaign around that. But at the end of the day, our bottom line is that kids should be in their homes, their homes where at all possible. If not, within their circle of love, with an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, an older sibling. If not, in their community of support and love. And the last alternative is coming into a stranger care situation. So that's the focus of the organization, is to keep kids in their homes when it's safe, and so on. And if they can't remain in that home for that period of time because the parents or the parent needs to work out some stuff, then try to get them into the home of an aunt and uncle in their circle of love.
The kinship, yes.
And that could be, that necessarily doesn't have to be blood relatives. It could be someone who is in their circle of love that cares about them and that they trust and so forth.
That's right.
So the absolutely last alternative would be a foster home. And even then, we have to immediately look at how do we get them back home and in the community of love. So that's the focus of the organization. But we realize, even though we would prefer that no kids come into care, there is that possibility that that's going to happen. And if that happens, then at least they should be in a culturally matched, racially matched home, and with folks who will respect and be inclusive of and safe of their varying identities.
Yes. It's so, I love that you had said that, because, you know, as a therapist, I often have families come to me who are worried about, you know, Children's Aid, the society coming and taking their kids, or if I have to report something, they're concerned about that. And I've always maintained that the last resort is for them to take you out of your home. They will give you those resources to help and keep the child in the home. And the last resort is to take them out. And that is the mental health of it all. That is, you know, the the stigma of it all. It's just so important for people to understand that that system.
And that fear that you mentioned, you know, it's justifiable, because in prior years we practiced very differently. And as human beings, we learn, we develop, we change, or we're pushed to change, or we're forced to change. Because of social justice movements, because of advocates, fierce advocates. And we have some incredible advocates. And if we're speaking of the Black community, within the Black community, again, Black women have always led this work. It's just Black men in particular that has been showcased and all that, but Black women has always been there. Their scholarship, their sweat, their toil, their bodies have always been on the front lines. But
why?
We basically recognize the advocacy and leadership of Black men like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and so forth. But there's always been Black women. There have always been there, including the scholarship. But we quote Black men, but Black women, as well as queer people, as well as Black men who identify as 2S LGBTQ+. But again, we focus on Black, cisgender, those who identify as being heterosexual, and so on and so on. But that's another story that we'll get into. But yeah, it's through the work of community that change was brought about in child welfare, to the point where we're saying we have to keep kids in their community, in their circle of love, in their families at all as the best as we can, and the very last resort, when we can't find anyone else. We have an obligation, a legal obligation, to look for people in that child's circle of love before, as a last resort, we look at foster care, which we often call stranger care, right?
Yeah, exactly. I just want to circle back real quickly to when we talked about the institutions and the systems and the people that are in, I guess we can say, power, and how it's, you know, racialized white predominantly. Would you say that it is because the racialized Black, racialized Indigenous, racialized brown people don't feel that they could be at that level? Are they not given that chance to be at that level? Are they just not seeking that? Why is it predominantly white?
Okay, wow. Oh, you're getting deep on us. All right, so it's a combination of things.
Okay.
So I won't get back into the legacy pieces,
Right. Yeah.
because again, there are systems and structures
Mhm.
that are set up not in the benefit for those who are racialized Black, Brown, and those who are
Okay.
Indigenous.
Okay.
So that's already there.
Okay.
The system is made and built by a particular racialized group for their benefit and purposes. And long before other groups immigrated, um, essentially those systems were built not with them in mind and not with indigenous peoples in mind. And when enslaved Africans were brought to Canada or came through the Underground Railroad, the systems were there or being built, and so on. So that's one thing.
Okay.
But let's switch over to internalized racism, internalized anti-Blackness, internalized oppression. And if we stay with folks from the Black community, we have internalized the narrative of anti-Black racism. We embody that, over a lot of us. It's hard to escape it.
Yeah.
And in terms of what we're able to do, what we can or cannot do. And it's baked in us and socialized in us. And I'll just touch on implicit bias for a little bit. So that's where unconscious bias comes into play. And I know that folks in the social justice community hates unconscious bias because the critique around it is that it gives folks who are racialized white in particular an opt-out, that, oh, it's unconscious bias, it's not me.
Right.
My unconscious bias that, is causing various forms of isms, including racism. But, what the research, neuroscience, emotional intelligence, machine learning, and, AI learning and all those pieces and other literature is that there is unconscious bias. And essentially we tend to be biased against those in a positive way that shares our identity. And we tend to be biased against those in a negative way that are in our outgroup. And of course, we have many outgroups based on race, gender expression, sexual diversity, faith, and all that.
Right.
And we belong to various social groups, whether based on our identity markers or simply we like a particular sports team or whatever it might be. So we belong to so many different groups. So the brain is hardwired to be biased. Again, biased in a positive way, those who share our group identities or social identities, and biased against those who don't. And we're hardwired that way. The brain is literally wired to be biased in that way. And basically, social scientists will, take it back to prehistoric times and how we sort out who's a part of your tribe, who's not, to be safe and so forth, and blah, blah, blah. How to identify your people, I guess. So that's on one level, but we're also socialized, which is the software, to be biased against those that are in our out-group in a negative way, and biased against those in our in-group in a positive way, right? And we're socialized, which is called racialized when we're talking about race, because that's socialization. That's why I say racialized white. So those who are racialized white are racialized in a way to think that they hold dominance and supremacy over others, and they have certain privileges, and they're given certain privileges. Those who are racialized Black are racialized in a way to say you have certain giftings, maybe physical ability, maybe music, maybe spirituality. That's your lane, stay in it. And women are socialized to say this is your nurturers, you are you're emotional, and so forth. you're illogical, and all these things. And
Yes.
stay in that lane. What do you mean you want to be a CEO of a company? You don't have the logical thinking to do that. You're too emotional and all those pieces, right?
Yes.
So we basically slot people in these columns where they're socialized in it. And when we're talking about race, you're racialized into a particular column, and you're told what you can or cannot do. And you see millions of images, right, throughout your life that reinforces what you should do and what you can't do.
Right.
So you can't run from internalizing anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness, right?
Yes.
And then you take on this thing that, no, I can't be a CEO. No, I can't rise in the ranks because I'm, and it's not a conscious thinking. It's baked into you through, again, socialization, right?
Right.
So that's what we have to fight against.
Interesting.
And what comes a part of that is that historical and intergenerational trauma as well.
Yes.
That is baked in us and is baked in our genes and our DNA. That we also have to work against. So it's so layered. There's so much work that we have to do that is bodily work in our bodies, not only up here, but in our bodies that we don't attend to, and we tend to only attend to the cognitive as opposed to the limbic brain. We attend to the neocortex, so talk therapy and so forth, but we don't drop down into the reptilian brain and the limbic brain, where we need to actually do a lot of work, which requires a lot of mindfulness work. It requires a lot of trauma informed work or trauma work. And so on. So, that's the reasons why we're not getting into those spaces. First and foremost is because of systemic and structural oppression, but it also, we have internalized those messages that comes from systemic and structural isms, and we have to do some internal work.
Right. It's so interesting that, it's many years ago, but all of that is still impacting us today. It's preventing us from reaching our full potential, essentially, because we still have this ingrained in us. So it's fascinating. It really is. And once we learn that, once we understand that, we need to rise up and do something about it. And I love that your shirt says unlearn. And my next question to you, is, okay, so we have this knowledge. We know about the intergenerational trauma. We know what has happened. We know that it's affecting us today. What do we need to do? What needs to happen now? What do we do with this?
Well, we have to somehow make movements, which leads to individual, interpersonal, systemic, structural change. And what I mean by that is the murder of George Floyd, for example. That to me was a moment in time that went global, and Black people tried to turn it into a movement, and they were joined by co-conspirators, so who are racialized white, brown, and also indigenous, right? And notice I didn't say ally, I said co-conspirator, co-conspirators. So people tried to take that moment to turn it into a movement, which the hope was that it lead to individual, interpersonal, systemic, and structural change. But my worry and fear from the beginning is that this will remain a moment, and then we'll transition out of it. And then things will center back to dominance and to supremacy. Because we've seen this moment before, right? Rodney King in the 1990s. The same sort of, not to this extent and so forth, but programs were kicked in, employment programs for Black and Indigenous youth. There was a lot of different monies being tossed around, and people thought, oh, this is it. This moment is going to last, and it's going to lead to systemic and structural change.
Yes.
Then that moment faded, and then it faded back into centering dominance and supremacy.
Did we lose momentum? What happened?
Well, it's driven by emotions. These moments that are caught up in our bodies, whether that body be black, white, brown, indigenous, and we truly want change to come about. And you have those who are in power, who are largely racialized white, truly want change to come about. But then the emotions fade, and your attention moves onto something else, whether that be another form of ism, and so forth. So it's all operating on this scarcity of resource and the attention of the gaze of the larger population. So we could only focus on one thing at a time. Either it's anti-Black racism, or anti-Indigenous racism, or anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, or anti-Asian hate or ism. So our attention, we're tricked to believe that we could only deal with one thing at a time, and the resources are scarce, not only in terms of attention, but also material resources and so forth. Right. So essentially, George Floyd, then we were fading very quickly from that. Then we were focused on anti-Asian racism, quite. We need to address it. Then we shift our gaze to Islamophobia, given what well, actually to
indigenous,
anti-Indigenous racism. Then we've shifted to Islamophobia. Then if something else, which I hope doesn't happen to another equity-seeking group or indigenous group, we then shift. So we have failed as a society to move beyond moments in time, to translate the movements that come out of them into actual systemic and structural change towards liberation for all. Because once you liberate, you have to liberate all of us, right? As the common saying goes, if we liberate, your liberation is dependent on my liberation. And it includes the liberation of those who are racialized white as well. Because if we're all liberated, it means that people who are racialized white is also liberated, because they have, again, trauma that they're carrying around, and they can't be their full selves. And we've been focusing on white supremacy and white dominance, but there's male supremacy and male dominance. There's able-bodied supremacy and dominance. There's cisgender supremacy and dominance. And so forth. It's only when we talk about whiteness, people get their backs up and, wait, you can't talk about that because it's kept in place by making it invisible, unnamed. But in order to address it, you have to name it.
You have to name it.
Make it visible in order to address it. And that's why it's so hard to talk about whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, white dominance. But we're more readily to talk about, which is good, but not good enough, obviously, male toxicity, male violence, male dominance, male supremacy. So we have to develop that racial literacy and comfort to also talk about dominance and supremacy when it comes to race. So that's the thing that we have to begin to grapple with. And it requires, on the individual level, we have to grapple with white supremacy, white fragility, white dominance, and the other forms of dominance and supremacy. So I have to grapple with, self-interrogate, and so on, when it comes to male dominance, male supremacy, for example, able-bodied supremacy and dominance that lives in me. I have to grapple with that, and so forth. So I have to grapple with it on an individual level. Right? And I have to work through that, because male dominance, male supremacy exist in all of us, every single one of us, including women, right? Because they are socialized to socialize various genders, and I'm being inclusive here, of cisgender and transgender people, to fit a certain role. So it's not only males doing that socialization, it's that aunt, it's that mother, it's that grandmother.
Yeah.
Dude
Yes.
wearing pink. Boys don't wear pink. Put on blue. And
Yes.
all that.
Yes.
So they reinforce that toxicity, that male violence, that dominance
Yes.
in us. So it's in the water we breathe. It's in the water that we swim in, the air that we breathe. It's in me. So I have to deal with that dominance when it comes to patriarchy and so forth.
Right.
And I have to address it in order to make it different. Then I have to show up differently in interpersonal relations. When I'm engaging folks, I have to do that inner work to show up differently. Then systemically, I have to work as a co-conspirator to change the system. And a system is one organization, right?
Okay, yeah.
Then structurally is when different institutions or systems foster, sustain, and amplify forms of isms, whether it be sexism, transphobia, racism, or what have you.
Okay.
So we have to work on an individual level on ourselves,
Yes.
then how we engage interpersonally,
Yes.
then the
We
organizations, the system, and then structurally, right?
Yes.
So there's no good, it's no good if my agency only fixed itself.
Yeah.
But then we don't work to bring the police along, to bring mental health along, the hospitals, education, and all that. Because the greatest referral source typically to a CAS is really education and police traditionally.
Okay.
So on.
Yes.
So we have to bring everyone together.
Right,
again,
because you also use other resources too to help support the clients that you have. So everybody's involved in all of this.
Exactly. So we all have a part to play, right? So we've really focused our conversation around race and so on, but there's dominance that occurs across all other identities as well as supremacy. And we have to grapple that within ourselves because we all have identities of dominance as well as identities of marginality that are equity seeking, including those who are racialized white and so on. So we all have work to do. I have work to do to deal with my supremacy and dominance when it comes to being Anglophone, when it comes to being able-bodied in certain ways, whether it be physically, cognitively, mentally, and so forth. I have dominance and supremacy in my maleness, in the fact that I speak with this fluency, that I'm middle class, I'm formally educated. I have a lot of identities of dominance and supremacy that I have to work to change what's a privilege for me to be a right for those who don't share that dominance that I hold and the privilege that comes from it. So we all have work to do, every single one of us.
It doesn't really end, right? I feel like it's learning, and you're constantly learning, you're constantly doing the work, because for the future generation, we want to change that narrative and ensure that it's brighter, it's better. And so it's always about work. It's always about doing the work. Wow. So and speaking of work, what's next for you? And what are you really leading the way right now in doing?
Well, I'm coming to you as I'm speaking on behalf of myself and not on behalf of my organization. But in terms of what's next for me, it's really developing myself, developing the work that I do on my own outside of the work that I do for my organization, the organization that I'm part of, and the work that I'm helping to lead. It's really to develop some things that I'm doing on the side in terms of working with other organizations and providing professional development sessions around equity and so forth. So in the short term, that's where I'm going. And another part of it is really working on myself and all those areas of dominance that I mentioned to ensure that I'm showing up differently
Yes.
for folks who don't share my privilege and the dominance that I have in certain identities that I hold. And also to look at, because when even you look at the Black community, and I alluded to this earlier, is that when we talk about Black folk, is a particular Black folk that we're talking about that holds different identities that are intersecting.
Yes.
So we're talking about on polarities of gender, Black men and women, cisgender, who identify as being heterosexual, who have a particular faith, who speak English, and so on.
Yes.
We're not looking at Black folk who identify as being trans, who are francophone, who are from different parts of the planet, who are Muslims, who are Jewish or other faiths,
yes,
who have who are persons living with a disability, and so on.
yes,
And who is
yes,
not from the Caribbean, because I find that in this part of the world, in this you know, in you know, being in Ontario, being in the Greater Toronto area, being in York Region, and all across, it's generally Jamaicans in particular, and if not Caribbeans, that we often speak about.
yes.
And we make assumptions that people who are Nigerian, Ghanaian, and all that share our worldview, our language, our faith, our beliefs, our values, and all that, which is not true.
No, it's
But
not.
even within the Black community, there is dominance and supremacy of certain identities that we have to work through. And there's, you know, there's also obviously transphobia, homophobia that exists within our communities. There's also various biases against different faiths. You know, if I'm Christian, you know, it's the only pathway to get to heaven and all those pieces. So even within the community, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of accepting folks, not only in their racialized bodies, but also in all other identities that intersect.
That's right. That's right. Whew, Michael. Good. But my very last question to you is: and I promise this is it. Are you confident that the work that needs to still be done will be done? Are you confident in our ability to do this, to really face what needs to change and to get it done?
I think so. I always have hope, because I look back on the trajectory of where we have come from and where we're going. And the fight and the resiliency within human beings as a whole, and with our focus with the conversation being on the Black community and anti-Black racism in particular, the resiliency of our ancestors. And as we often say, we don't frame our history and our legacy just around the enslavement of population of Africans, because it wasn't the entire, you know, continent of folks of African descent were enslaved. It's was a segment, and our history expands far beyond that period. That is more of a history of white supremacy than it is of African history, because it expands far beyond that moment in time, and it will expand far beyond. And I think if we look at other identity markers like women, for example, talk about the 3 waves of feminism in Canada in particular and all that, and how that evolved, and the strengths of women in general and various racialized bodies, and how that movement splintered into different movements as it has landed today. But so I have hope in in feminism, in the continued women's movement, and so forth. I have faith in the disability movement and what I see happening there, as well as just other movement, the transgender movement, or the overall the 2S LGBTQ plus movement as well. So I have hope. I see hope, and I see people of all racialized identities getting on board and working together. I see people of various equity-seeking identities working together. I see Indigenous peoples moving, and it's just, from what I've been told through various learning sessions and teachings, that it's in their legacy, it's in their ancestry, it's that resiliency and so forth. So I have hope. I have hope. And at the end of the day, we are all human beings, regardless of the racialization of our skin.
Yes.
Whether you're racialized white, whether you're racialized black, brown, and Indigenous. And I purposely separate Indigenous peoples because they see, prior to being racialized red, they were nations.
Yes.
They're not. They don't see themselves as being a race. They were a nation prior to the invention of race. So
absolutely.
Anyway, yeah. So essentially, regardless of how people are racialized, whether white, brown, black, I have hope in our common humanity and the love that we have across our identities, and that love will, I personally believe, will always fend against hate and will always win out. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of justice or the arc of it just slipped me, but essentially the arc of humanity bends towards justice. That wasn't exact words, but that really, I guess, is what he has said. And then it really bends towards towards love, towards justice, towards hope, towards our common humanity, as opposed to bending towards hate and injustice and inequities and so on.
Right. Well, you heard it here, folks. He has hope. So let's get to work. I want to thank you so much, Michael, for this conversation. This is, oh man, I know everybody has learned something today. Taking pieces of what you said, take it all. It's been so enlightening, and I'm so thankful for the work that you do, that you continue to do, and that you are employing others to do. So really, thank you so much for being on here and talking with us, and just really helping to spread this word and really educating us on what's next, what we need to do. So thank you so much, Michael. Thank you.
And perhaps we'll engage again. I'm coming as me, as Michael Bowe, but perhaps we'll engage in a conversation where I'm actually representing the organization, talking about some of the projects that we're working on.
I'd love to hear that. So thank you so much. Thank you all for watching. And we have one next week as well. So please tune in. Again, have a good night. And thank you again, Michael.
No problem. Take care. Bye-bye. Have a good night.